Minutes past 4, and we have Mark Emerson on the line from Creation Ministries International. Good afternoon, Mark. How are you?
G'day, Mike. Really well, thank you.
Very
Loved
good.
being with you all last week.
Oh, look, and a lot of people were quite excited to hear about the dinosaurs last week, I've got to say. Now, Mark, of course, you have a website, creation.com. People can go and ask many questions on the website. Just type them in there, and there's thousands of pages of information, creation.com. But if anybody does have a question during the day, please send us a text, 0401 949 949, and I can give it to Mark straight away and he can answer it on air, because there's probably a lot of other people with similar questions. Now, Mark, last week we talked a little bit about where you came from and what you've done, and of course we heard about the Air Force and CSiro, but I believe there was a little bit in between that we didn't really get onto.
It's true.
Yep.
I was in the Air Force, and our oldest daughter, our first child, was born disabled, and so I got a discharge from the Air Force to work with her. And when the money ran out, literally, I became a secretary because I could type. And the agency I was working for would send me to different places. It was a bit of a story. I'd turn up at places where they'd expect a young lady, and he was this young man. But they were a Christian organisation. They said, "Have you thought about working for World Vision?" And it never crossed my mind. Yeah, so I went there and I temped for a short time, helping them process the Ethiopian famine donations, and very quickly ended up redesigning that.
Wow. And so you say you travelled a little bit with them?
I did. Through the time that I was there, I worked on international systems, improving communications between the support countries like Australia, America, Canada, and Hong Kong and others, and into the field offices. So I got to travel quite a bit to see how the work actually happens.
Yeah, right. I've always been interested. We hear that, a certain percentage with any sort of, charitable institution, a certain percentage of the money goes obviously to paying for wages and that sort of thing, and a certain percentage goes to, people in the field. And I guess there's people that are always working on how to reduce the expenses that aren't going into, literally feeding people and looking after those people in the third world.
That's true, and certainly none less so than World Vision. At my time there, we did do that type of work, and I implemented an international communications system so that the information could be sent digitally in the early days before the internet, as on dial-up lines and so on, to reduce overall some 400 tonnes of material that was sent between the field and the support countries. And so that saved them an awful lot of money. It was just great, which means more money can be spent in the communities. And so I'm very praiseworthy of World Vision and the work that we did there, and the way lives really are changed.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that would have suited you coming out of a telecommunication operator position or cryptographer with the RAF. And then, of course, it was after that you went into the CSIRO and Senior IT Project Manager. What sort of projects were you working on there?
Quite a range of different things, software development, hardware acquisition, installations, organisational change, all sorts of things. One of the really interesting projects, and the one I'm probably most proud of, was working with scientists in the way they capture their science. So it might be a surprise for people to learn that scientists still write all their experiments, their formulas, their failures and successes, and all their notes, quite literally in a faint ruled notepad, very special notepad. It's all accounted for and controlled, but it's just a notepad. And I had the pleasure of working with a lot of scientists to come up with a digital version of that, and so that they could take their notepads wherever they went into hostile environments, if they're out in the field or in a secure laboratory of some kind where they might spill chemicals on it and all the rest of it. At least everything's saved. And that was a fascinating project, because I managed to save the organisation some $34 million.
Wow. And that's
I didn't get any.
But they can certainly put that back into the science that they do. And a lot of the science that the CSIRO do, it's operational science.
That's correct, and I'm glad you raised that. It's a very important point. I found many scientists aren't aware of the kind of science that they actually do, or the nature of the science. The operational science, or otherwise known as experimental science, is very much a part of what CSiro does. And no doubt laboratories around the world, they pull things apart, figure out how they work, try to put them back together again and change something for their benefit, whatever it might be. And that's all experimental or operational science. But it doesn't help us answer the question of why things work, where it came from, where matter and life and the universe came from. It's unable to tell us about, for example, forensic science. If a detective comes across a dead body, they can do all sorts of operational science on the things in the environment, the blood, the position, the whatever that might be there, but it doesn't tell them about who did it and who that person was and why. They've got to make up a story about that.
And of course, historical science, is there any of that in the CSIRO?
There is. There are the geological areas where they try to understand what's gone on in the past. But generally there's a confusion between the operational and the experimental. Operational science is very much fact-based. It's statistics, measuring things, quantifying, and controlling all the variables, etc. So you can repeat that experiment perhaps tomorrow, which is always in the present. You can only actually do science right now. You can't do it tomorrow, because tomorrow will be today, you see. And so scientists are unaware, really, that actually you're only doing it today. So when you've got to do some science on something that you know was alive in the past, like a fossil, you've got a problem, because you still have that fossil only in the present. And like the forensic detective who's got a body in front of them, they weren't there in the past to see exactly what happened unless they've got an eyewitness account to tell them what went on. So geologists, paleontologists and so on have got a real challenge when it comes to trying to figure out what went on in the past. And they have to rely a lot more on their assumptions about what they believe about the world, because nobody was there to write it down. Fossils don't come out of the ground with a date on them, or with a little storybook beside them to say this is what happened. So now we get into the worldview sort of problem of beliefs.
Yeah.
And that can that really influences the scientists' conclusions.
Yes. Mark, I'm going to have to jump. It's past 4, and we have Mark Emerson on the line from Creation Ministries International. And we've been, over the last couple of weeks, learning a bit about what Mark has done, from the Air Force to right up to, at the moment, we're talking about the CSIRO and a few different questions there. And, of course, there was World Vision in the middle. And, Mark, I have an interesting question for you. It's one that I've had thrown at me and I don't have any answers for. But I know that the CSIRO has done a lot of work for farmers here on the Central Coast. And, they're often sort of telling our farmers, if there's a better species or a better, I don't know if you could call it species, different type of plant that they should be planting on their farms. We have an area here which we call the Mountain. And there's a lot of big farms up there. And I've heard of a lot of different plants that have been sort of chopped up, spliced and added together. And some people call that evolution. Has that got anything to do with evolution when they start to mix up the sort of different species or different kinds together? I don't know if they're kinds or species. They're mixing the plants up and joining them back together again and making something else. What do you call that?
I call it Frankenstein plant or something. There's a cartoon that has scientists working feverishly over all these test tubes and flasks and working out to, now, if we can just prove life in this test tube, we'll have shown that no intelligence was required. But of course, an enormous amount of intelligence is applied to the problem of understanding plants and how they grow, how cells divide and do all their thing and all the rest of it. And we can discover a lot about that to improve plant stock and crops, produce fruit that survive environmental conditions that they might otherwise naturally succumb to. So that's certainly not anything to do with evolution, which requires an explanation somehow of the original orange seed that became oranges and then continues to produce nothing but oranges. We've got a lot of experiments that have gone on over centuries of people planting different types of crops, and they've only ever produced after their kind. So orange trees produce oranges, and fruit trees of all kinds produce fruit of their kind. So speciation are different types of oranges, that can naturally show some subtle variations in them, and some of those species may be more tolerant to frosts or pests of some kind, and intelligently and artificially humans can get in there and improve those conditions, but of course they're not doing anything in terms of creating the orange seed or creating some other next type of thing. It's all within the kind. So that's definitely not what evolution requires. It requires the addition of information never previously there in order to create oranges or something.
Alrighty.
So a lot of good work's done by CSiro in all sorts of fields and it's all sort of outside my skills, but basically it's not evolution.
Okay, well, we'll come back to you very shortly, Mark. You're on 90s International. And if you have any questions for Mark, please send them through to our question line, which is a text line. Just text 0401 949 949. Now, Mark, often we talk about stuff that's come up in the last few weeks in news as well in this segment. And I've got to say, I did see something this week which I sort of laughed at, because Dr. John had mentioned it once before that, you know, scientists love to say they've got the oldest or the biggest or the loudest or the coolest or the something-est, because then they get paid and people like to, you know, follow that sort of science. And this week they come up with, you know, one of the oldest ever dinosaur fossils. And I sort of looked at it and I thought, yeah, that's funny. It's the oldest, but how do they put an age on those things? I mean, the fact that they can say that this one's actually older than another one, and when they're talking in these millions and millions of years, it looks impossible.
Well, you can put a rock in your hand and look at it and decide, is it old or not? How do you know? What does old look like? We're so conditioned when it comes to dinosaurs and bones in the ground that when we see something like that, oh, it's old. But it's a little bit misleading. So how do they determine the age of fossils?
Yes.
Well, very often there's a scale that they use, which was designed way, way back when they first saw geological layers appearing out of the ground around Scotland and so on. And they analysed it. In fact, it was a biblical creationist that tried to start making sense out of geology and started the whole process, like Steno. But there are other people that didn't like what they were finding, namely catastrophic things, the catastrophe that had occurred, and they didn't like that because that meant that Noah must be true. So they started applying dates and ages to the layers, believing that the key to the past is really things happening today. It's what's been going on today has been going on forever. And so they really have made up this story about the past and applied ages to these layers, millions and millions of years, and turning them into eras and eons, and the fossils that are present relatively sort of in different layers, but really simpler marine creatures all the way up through then to heavy dinosaurs, big dinosaurs. And they just lined that up. So, oh, there you go, we've got creatures that are certain ages. But it's a bit circular because they look at the material that the fossil's in, the layer that it's in, and then that layer is associated with an era or an eon. But that was all determined by these other index fossils, and it just goes round and round. Not long ago, people decided to measure carbon, see if there's any carbon-14 in fossil bones, and they never expected them to be, because really after about 90,000 years, you can't measure any isotopes of carbon-14. But they did, and they found that there's lots of it. They can't be as old as they're made out to be. They've also found soft tissue inside dinosaur bones. I'm sure if you're aware of that. But they did. They broke up in bones and they smell, and they looked at the material. Dr. Mary Schweitzer did this work. She's not a friend of creationists. She couldn't deny it that she'd found stuff inside fossil bones. Well, there's scientists, paleontologists now around the world breaking bones open, all sorts of dinosaurs, and they're finding soft stuff inside, cells, blood cells, ligaments.
And they can still smell it.
And it smells. In fact, they've known that for some time. They go to these huge fossil graveyards, they're called, all creatures that wouldn't normally be together, but they're all buried together, clearly pushed into a certain environment and buried, and it smells. So there's the age of these things is really interpreted by the geologist or the field geologist according to their worldview, their beliefs about these things. It's not the science that actually tells them the age. The carbon-14 radiometric dating is a misnomer. It can tell you about the ratio of carbon-14 and carbon-12 in a sample, or the various radioactive elements like potassium and argon, but there's a lot of assumptions around that. And so the final interpretation of the fossil's age is left up to the community of like-minded evolutionists, or those that believe in God's word that these things cannot be millions of years old. Many of them are buried as a result of Noah's flood, therefore only about 4,000 years ago. That's a shock for a lot of people, but when you look at the evidence in that regard and actually look at carbon-14 being present in these creatures, it makes sense. They can't be that old. It's good science, carbon-14 measurement.
Yeah.
And, even in coal. So if we look at fossils in the form of fossilized trees and plant material in huge deposits around the world, the belief in the evolutionary timescale is that the lower level of coal is about 300 million years old and the top is about 10 million years. Nobody bothered to see if there's any carbon-14 present because it would be long gone. But, in fact, samples were taken at many layers all the way up that sort of thing, and they found carbon-14 in all of those samples, and indeed about the same amount, all which says it was all laid down about the same time.
Wow.
A lot of evidence is for a young Earth. In fact, if you go to creation.com/age, A-G-E, creation.com/age, we've got some 101 evidences for a young Earth.
Wow, that's interesting. It's same age as far as the carbon dating is concerned, right the way through, and there shouldn't be any carbon in there. But I'm more blown away by the fact that you said some of this stuff smells. Like, I lived in a place over at Point Clare years ago that used to get some bush rats in there, and look, I've smelt a rat when it's been dead for a couple of days. They're not very pleasant, but I've got to say, after a few months, I've found rats that look like they've been dead for, probably a year, and they don't smell anymore. Yet you're saying these fossilised bones still had an odour to them, and they're meant to be millions of years old.
That's correct. And look, it's not even just dinosaurs that can have smell or fossilised bones. They dug up in a German pit supposedly 10 million year old dates. And the dates still had flavonoids in them. They still smelt sweet, and they have all those signatures of being fresh dates, but clearly permineralized, but can't possibly have been millions of years old. There's so many examples of this that most people don't get to hear about these evidences, these samples of things that should not be young. That we're told time and again that they're old, because most evolutionary paleontologists don't really know where to position these things in their geological story, because it conflicts with what they want to believe. But believe it we must, because the science that analyses carbon-14 and radiometric dating is well understood. And we even have carbon-14 in diamonds, for example. We're told time and again they're billions of years old, formed deep in the earth. There should not be any carbon in yet diamonds are pure carbon. And there is carbon-14 in diamonds.
So why shouldn't there be carbon in there? What does the carbon-14 do? Does it not naturally just remain as is?
No, it doesn't actually. So there's carbon-12, carbon-13 and carbon-14. Carbon-12, very stable indeed, and carbon-14 is unstable. It's actually manufactured by cosmic rays hitting the upper atmosphere of the Earth, striking nitrogen-14 atoms, turning them into carbon-14. And while you're alive, all of us, every living thing, consumes carbon-14. We breathe the air, we eat other things, whatever. So we end up having a balance of carbon-14 and carbon-12 in our bodies that matches the environment, the same ratio. The moment you die, you stop eating, then the carbon-14 continues to decay, but it's no longer being replaced. So as long as you're alive, you've got about the same amount of carbon-14 in your body as in the atmosphere, and then it starts to change as you stop consuming carbon-14. So that's why dinosaurs 65 million years ago that died should not have any carbon-14 in it, because the half-life of carbon-14 is 5,730 years. So after about 15 half-lives, 115,000 years, there can't possibly be any measurable carbon-14. And yet we find it in once-living things all the time, in all sorts of environments. Even if the entire Earth was a clump of carbon-14, pure carbon-14, a huge clump, it would all be gone in less than 1 million years.
Wow.
So carbon-14 is a great tool that shows us that the Earth and once living things cannot possibly be millions of years old like we're told.
Okay, and now that's operational science, the carbon dating.
That is good operational science.
And then historical science, where they're sort of, the more the guesswork is, we reckon it's this old, and the two aren't marrying up.
Two don't match up.
How do the guys that do the historical science, how do they sort of explain that?
Well, Mary Schweitzer, when she broke open a bone and conducted her experiments many times because she couldn't believe what she was seeing, and in America, at 60 Minutes in the United States, we interviewed her and looked at her work, and she showed them what she did, and she said to them, it's irrefutable, basically. There's blood cells here, there's nucleated cells, there's ligaments, and they're actually stretchy. She said, of course, I couldn't believe it, because after all, the bone is 65 million years old.
Mm-hmm.
And so what the problem is for her is that she's got this paradigm, this worldview that says that the fossil is 65 million years old. We know dinosaur DNA cannot last that long, even under the best conditions of DNA being kept warm at 15 degrees, under the most pristine of conditions. It'll all break down within 200,000 years or less. But here it is, 65 million years. And so she's got her worldview, her paradigm overriding good science that says we shouldn't have this squishy stuff here. But the question actually is, we've got squishy stuff. The dinosaurs can't be that old. But then that would put her into conflict with her colleagues.
Wow.
She got into conflict as it was. And but now they're breaking bones everywhere, and they're trying to find explanations for how this stuff has survived over 65 million years or more. One theory was that the level of iron in the blood and so on might have been much, much higher, and iron is a bit of a preservative. They conducted an experiment over several years. They said, look, it might extend it by 1,000 years, not millions of years. So everyone's left it now. We're not touching that. It's a hot potato.
Wow. I mean, at the end of the day, we're not talking about, it's 10% out or 20% out or even 50 or 100% out. We're talking thousands and thousands of percent.
Correct.
way out of the ballpark. So, wow, operational science has, I guess, really proven against this whole historical science thing, but sadly, the world so believes it. Oh, Mark. Look, we've come to the end of another week, and I reckon I could go for another hour with you right now, but I'm really looking forward to next week. We've got you again next week, don't we?
You have indeed. Yeah, I look forward to it.
Excellent. It's every time I speak to one of you guys, I get slightly different answers, and you hear something that just sort of blows your mind. In this case, one, the coal. I can't believe that, they found the carbon-14 in coal. It's the same date right the way through, and they say it's meant to be millions of years old. Number two, there's an odour in some of the fossils that are meant to be millions of years old. Yeah, It doesn't sound right, does it?
A good scientist would go and explore all the evidence and understand that they're biased, but go and let the evidence and interpret that evidence fully, allow themselves to be fully informed. Unfortunately, we don't. We're told all the time, you must only view the evidence this way. It's old, it's evidence of evolution. Yeah. And that has done a massive disservice to science.
Yes. Well, thank you, Mark. Another awesome week, and we're really looking forward to having you back again next week.
Thank you very much. God bless you. God bless every listener too.
You're on 94.9 this afternoon. If you do have any